You're listening to Al Pastor, the show that helps you love God, love your neighbor, and eat more tacos. I'm your host, Pastor Brian. Welcome to the show. Well, hello. I want to welcome you today to episode number 25. We're in for a special treat. I have a couple of guests here with me in the studio, and I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them. So we have Miguel Rivera, and we have Shiloh. You guys want to say hi?
Hi.
Hello.
How are you guys doing today?
Pretty good.
Well, welcome to Al Pastor. I want to say welcome. Now, normally what we do is I ask everyone what their favorite tacos are. Now, you guys are going to do a couple of episodes with me, so we're going to do today's and tomorrow's episode. So one of you can share what your favorite taco is. Who wants to share first? You want to share, Shiloh?
Yeah.
Okay, what is your favorite taco? And you got to be descriptive because they can't see, so they can only hear you, okay?
Got it. So my favorite taco is a corn tortilla.
Okay.
I don't like flour tortillas that much. I'll eat them, but I prefer corn. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's a little weird. It's going to get a little weird for some people. So it's got beans, like refried beans, rice, and carne asada.
Wow. Now, where do you get this taco from?
So you can get taco in a variety of places. So if you ever go to a place that like Mr. Taco and you serve rice and beans,
Okay.
You take the meat out of taco and you put the rice and beans on the side in the taco, and then you put the meat back in.
I kind of like that. So I'm going to give you an air horn, right? You get an air horn for good taco selection. So this is Mr. Shiloh's taco. Unfortunately, folks, you're going to have to tune in tomorrow if you want to hear Miguel's favorite taco. So I appreciate you both being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking about our reading today, which is 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. So as we've gone through this, I already posted an episode on some advice for reading the book of 2 Timothy. My recommendation, of course, is always the Bible Project. And I guess my question for you guys is, are you kind of familiar with the book already?
Yeah, I read the background today.
How about you, Shiloh?
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar. I spent today starting the first chapter, so. Good.
Good. This one's a pretty easy book compared to Hebrews, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, as far as the background goes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like pretty cut and dry. Paul, Timothy, Ephesus, right? He's in Ephesus. Paul's in jail, but there are some interesting things we might end up going over. So we can do this a couple of different ways, but I think we should just start right out of the gate, and we'll kind of go verse by verse. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right, so it says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, according to the promise of life, which is in Christ Jesus, to Timothy, a beloved son. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I just like how you use the will of God, kind of letting him know that he has the heavenly authority.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
For me, it's to Timothy, beloved son. Just how the relationship was like. He kind of viewed Timothy as a son.
So it shows the intimacy there, right?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, and I think sometimes people say this, but I think that we all need a Paul in our life, and we also all need a Timothy in our life too. And I think this is something that God has ordained or orchestrated for us. And so, yeah, both of those are good. So he says, grace, mercy, peace from God, the Father, and Christ Jesus our Lord. Verse 3, I thank God, with whom I serve with a pure conscience, as my forefathers did, as without ceasing I remember you in my prayers night and day. Any thoughts on that verse?
It reminds me where I think is it in Acts where Paul talks about how he had a covering over the two individuals who went away from the faith, and he had like his pastoral covering over him. And then we had that Bible study, and remember you talking about where didn't put two and together where as our pastor, you're praying for us. Yeah. So this automatically thought about that. Like, yeah.
So I think what I remember now what you're referencing. Part of that is Corinthians. I think when they expelled, so there was some church discipline, And sometimes people get that misconstrued by thinking, they just kicked him out or said, we're going to turn him over to Satan. But in reality, it was coming out from under the umbrella or the authority of that spiritual leadership. And then I'm also thinking our reading, which was yesterday as we wrapped up Hebrews, it was to remember our leaders, which are the elders and the pastors, the ones who taught us. So, so this, we see a great example of this, of Paul saying, I'm covering you. I've got your back in prayer. Big thing there. And for all of us, I want to remind us that the main job of anybody that's in ministry, especially when it's pastoring or teaching, the main role is to pray and to study God's word. And so I was with a group of pastors the other day, last week, and one of the questions that was posed for our discussion was if you could change anything about church, what would it be? And my response was, I feel like I'm there, but that I can completely devote myself to only studying the word and prayer, like totally, because sometimes we get wrapped up in things like, whether it's building projects, organization, helping people do this and do that. And, but this is exactly what Paul's doing. We should never forsake prayer. Prayer is powerful. Anything else in this verse that you guys see or picked up on?
No, I mean, it's straightforward. It kind of ties into verse 5 where kind of Paul, he's telling him like, I'm mindful of your tears, be filled with joy. And then he goes into verse 4 and then right into kind of verse 5.
Yeah. Well, here's my other little mini testimony, because I was focusing so much on verses 6 and 7 that I was tempted to just roll past these introductory parts. And I said, man, I can't do that. So I went back and I started studying this out. And there's one particular commentator. It's called a socio-rhetorical commentary by a guy named Witherington. I'm probably not saying his name correct. But here's what he said about the forefathers. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to paraphrase it. He said what Paul is doing is the same thing that Luke does, and he's making a connection from the Old Testament to the New Testament. In other words, he's saying this is not something new, although we're in a new covenant, and this is the new era in the New Testament. It's something new, but it's really old. And so he highlights the fact that Paul does this often, and I would not have connected these dots if he hadn't have mentioned that. So this whole idea of the forefathers goes back. It's a long history, because what was valued in the society was not necessarily something that's new, but what was valued is how old are you, right? Like we place value on whatever's new, like my new phone and new computer or new software, but not for them. The other thing that I saw in this that I thought was interesting is Paul says, whom I serve with a pure conscience. And that word serve is the word for worship. So it's used interchangeably. There's a couple of different words we could use for worship, but I think that this is a very important way that we've got to frame our lives, because Paul is saying, I worship the Lord with my life, whom I serve. And it carries with it almost like a priestly duty. And then, of course, the pure conscience. And Paul is defending himself almost in advance, not so much to Timothy, but because he doesn't have to because of his closeness. But what he's saying is I'm in chains and I've got clean hands. I've got a pure conscience before the Lord. So verse 4, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I might be filled with joy. Any thoughts or comments on that? And you guys can chime in anytime.
So I'm just reading from commentary here. References to Paul remembered how Timothy had tears on the last parting, which is possibly at Paul's second Roman arrest.
Yes.
And so sometime in this letter, chapter 4, verse 9, he would ask Timothy to join him in Rome because he longed for his companionship.
Yes. So you just hit on something, Shiloh. What do you think about that? I want to touch on maybe this is his second arrest. Mm-hmm. Have you looked into that at all? Or
Oh yeah. So what my contract thing about is arrest. Let me give a minute to find it.
so the reason I'm bringing this up is because sometimes we, I know that I've been stuck in this too, Miguel. Like, Paul went from Caesarea all the way to Rome, and sometimes we can think that was it. But it probably, actually, the more and more further I get, I'm like, no, that wasn't it. I think he got released. He was on house arrest, right? This imprisonment, we actually see some proof, because we're going to see at the end of Timothy that he was apprehended in Troas. And this is not house arrest. Like Paul knows this is going to be it. So this is a separate imprisonment. And we just read at the end of Hebrews, whoever the author is, I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail on that, but whoever the author was, Timothy was in jail.
Yeah.
So I'm convinced it's either Paul or Luke. So both of them. It was probably both. Probably Luke pinned it, and Paul was speaking, and Paul's like, "Take your liberty, Luke. Like, here's the idea, what I want them to know," and then Luke like put his elegant spin on it. That's my take. But the purpose of that is, it seems that the author of Hebrews was in Rome. There were Romans that were with him, and Timothy had a period of time that he tasted this imprisonment. Not that he hadn't before. I mean, he's been on the road with Paul, but something about this. So they had a departure. Shiloh, you just said that the last time, so you were referencing like the book of Acts when Paul departed from Ephesus, and so he had tears. So any thoughts as to why Paul is desiring to see Timothy?
So on my commentary's life application says how like during this time Paul was in the cold, dark, lonely dungeon, and during his time, his first imprisonment, he was visited by many friends, but during his secondary imprisonment, he was almost totally alone.
Yes, yeah. So he's wanting companionship. So that's definitely one reason. There could be also another reason is not only that, but Paul has this desire to strengthen and encourage Timothy even more to what he's going to tell him, like, hey, press on, let's move on, combat against these apostate false teachers. So anything else, or you guys want to move on? So verse 5, so he says, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that's in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, I am persuaded is in you also. Any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Shiloh. Go ahead.
Okay, so usually in Jewish household, the father taught someone about like the law, but since Timothy's father was Gentile, that job was kind of bestowed on his mother and grandmother.
Yes.
Because they're both Jewish.
So what can we extract from that? We can probably extract that Paul had no problem with women teaching. That's for sure. So the norm for a Jewish boy would be for the first 5 years of their life, they were with mama. After 5, they were with dad from then on. So you were learning, the dad was responsible to teach them Torah and a trade. So depending on how far the child went in learning Torah from age 5, that determination normally was made sometimes anywhere from 8 years old up to 13. But that was all on the dad's shoulders. So you're absolutely right. You just brought up a great point that I think we need to make sure that we understand. Timothy's father was a Greek. It's his mother and his grandmother that were Jewish. So yeah, that's good. Any thoughts from you, Miguel? You had something?
So kind of talking about that, it's really interesting, and this is for grandparents listening. The first person he mentions is his grandmother.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then it goes to his mom. So, it kind of had the principle, and I'm paraphrasing Barton, where he talks about where grandparents, your grandchildren, not only do they need to see it, but they need to hear it.
Yeah.
And encourage them whenever possible.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And we could probably do the math in our head, but I I was just thinking, I'm like, okay, we know Timothy was young when he first encountered the Apostle Paul. We believe that it was when he had traveled through Lystra. So possibly Timothy could have been as young as 13 when he started traveling with Paul. How old was his mom when she gave birth?
Probably
Probably,
29, probably 16, 17.
Yeah,
Exactly.
probably I would say younger than 20
Yeah.
sometime.
Yeah. So the average age would be anywhere from 15, could even be younger, but average age 15, 16 years old. So let's think about this. How old would Lois have been if you just kind of keep with that logic? Lois, even though she's a grandma, she would be like a mother today, right?
Yeah.
40, in her 40s, probably
Yeah.
mid 40s.
Yeah, early to mid 40s.
Late 30s.
Yeah. So that's kind of crazy. Well, I guess unless you're from Marvin, right? Sometimes people from Marvin, they make them young.
But, thinking about it that way, Lois may have been the first one to.
That's the point.
Yeah. She the one who became a Jewish Christian.
Correct.
And then her daughter, and then it followed to her grandson.
Yeah. And we can also surmise, because we're also going to see that Paul's going to exhort Timothy later. He's going to say, he's going to talk about the scriptures that can make you wise, which you've known from your youth. So there seems to be an indication that Timothy was well brought up in Torah from a very, very young age. So you've got Lois and Eunice that must have been faithful to the synagogue at Lystra and converted. I mean, heard the news about the Messiah. That's a big, big deal. So also interesting, if any of you at home study out, the word for genuine here which means that you are like you would be unhypocritic. So it's the opposite of a hypocrite. So it's the word is I don't know how to say it in Greek, so I apologize, but it's meaning you're genuine, you're not a hypocrite. So he's saying you have something on the inside of you, Timothy, and I don't want you to doubt it. I don't want you to question it. I see it in you. And I think that this is also important for all of us, is that we speak into people's lives things that we see. Because and I'm not saying that Timothy was doubting his faith, but there are times when we hit the rough patches of the road that we can question whether or not we're, in the faith, or did I ever really have faith? Was this whole thing real? And so Paul is affirming him, saying, you're the real deal. Reminds me of what Jesus said to, was it Philip? Yeah, Philip. You are a true Israelite, in whom is no Jacob, no guile, no deceit. So, that's pretty good. Verse 6, therefore I remind you, stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Do you guys have any thoughts on that one?
Just it's the common practice going back to the Old Testament, the laying of hands.
Mm-hmm.
If kind of you would transfer like your ministry or your mantle from one person to another.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of how Paul is saying, I've like almost like Paul's he's encouraging him, like Timothy's going through probably a rough spot, and Paul's saying, look, I've mentored you, I've poured into you.
Yeah.
Like you have it, you already have it. You know what I mean? It's you're equipped.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so sometimes there's some talk about this, about the gift, like what's the reference here? And I think you just hit the nail on the head, because the gift is actually, I think the best way we can think about it is like a commissioning or an ordaining service, to say, you know what, we recognize, and there are gifts that God gives, and this is a special gift of grace. This is the way that it's worded from most scholars, a gift of grace to serve in this capacity. And so the laying on of hands would have been both spiritual and ceremonial. And so he's reminding him back to that time and that day when he was commissioned. Now, if you remember, there was a time when Paul, the Apostle Paul himself, was commissioned in Antioch. in Antioch. And even in Antioch, the elders prayed, laid hands, spoke over him, and sent him and Barnabas out. So this is what that is. So he wants him to stir up that gift. He wants him to think back. It's not that it's been dormant or it's out. It's there. So this is a great reminder. Anything else on this verse? I feel like I had something, but I don't. It's not coming to my mind. Verse 7. So he says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Any thoughts, either of you, on that one?
From the Life Application Commentary, when we allow people to intimidate us, we neutralize our effectiveness for God. The power of the Holy Spirit can help us overcome our fear, what some might say or do to us, so that we can continue to do God's work.
That was good. Read that first sentence again.
When we allow people to intimidate us, we neutralize our effectiveness for God.
Wow, that is really, really good. I like that. So do you have any other thoughts on that? Like, why did that stand out to you? What were you thinking?
That Timothy might have been afraid.
Okay. What do you think he was afraid of?
Being arrested, persecution.
Okay. I think you're right. And do you know why he was afraid to be arrested?
I do not.
Okay. Well, we're going to find out towards the end, like in chapter 4, that Paul was apprehended in Troas, and that the same individual that was responsible for apprehending Paul in Troas is actually from Ephesus. So this is a guy that Paul expelled out of the church. Like, he disfellowshipped, gave him church discipline, expelled him. This guy turned around, I'm using our language, threw Paul under the bus to the Romans. Now Paul he's in the worst spot he's ever been in. In fact, because we know the end of the story, this is most likely where his life ends, and he knows it. Paul knows it as well. So because this guy's from Ephesus, it stands to reason he has influence, he has power, most likely he has wealth. Timothy knows who this man is, because Timothy's been around the block. So Timothy is like, think about this, your father in the faith, like, this is the Apostle Paul. If that happened to him, I don't think we can knock Timothy too much. I think this is the reason he might be a little bit scared. And not only that, what Paul's trying to get Timothy to do is preach the word. Like, what I mean preach the word, like, you need to preach the word, no compromises, unadulterated, no holding back. And you need to combat these these wolves that are creeping in. You're going to have to fight them. That's the job of a shepherd sometimes. So that is great. Miguel, do you have anything on this?
He kind of hit it where, Timothy's timid. Football's telling him this. He's trying to get him to build them up.
Yeah.
And get him, get back in the ministry. Like, you got to keep going.
You use the word timid. I really kind of thought about this quite a bit today, because I think that I question the characterizations of Timothy, because most commentators and scholars paint a picture of Timothy as being timid, not necessarily an A-type personality, kind of weak, almost effeminate, because, he has some stomach issues. Yeah. I'm not. This is the way that I interpret their characterization of Timothy, and I'm like, I don't think that this is fair. I think Timothy is probably a tough guy. I don't think by any way we can't say that, because when you look at the number of miles they've traveled, the number of things that they have done, who wouldn't have some stomach issues in the first century? I mean, come on, have you ever made a trip to Mexico? You're gonna, you better pack some Pepto-Bismol, right? So I question. I'm not saying whether it's true or not, but sometimes people will overly characterize Timothy like he's, timid. This is the largest church. Ephesus, it was the largest church in Asia Minor. So this is heavy, heavy stuff. But yes, he was. That the word is timid. And so, Paul is reminding him God has not given us a spirit of fear. I had a couple of things on this. Let me see if I can. I thought I made a note and I didn't. That's what I get. Or the note didn't save, one of the two. Let me see. Do you guys have anything else on this?
I think kind of touching on back on that, on where, Paul's, the if Timothy was the, the unfair characterization of Timothy, it kind of goes back to, First Timothy. Paul's been encouraging him, and and then here Paul has to write a second letter to kind of encourage him some more. Yeah. But I think it's also, we're comparing him to Paul, which, that's that
totally unfair comparison.
Yes. So
really is.
So kind of going back to that, like, okay, you know what? It's an unfair comparison. So he's not timid, but in Paul's eyes, because Paul was, Paul, he had a standard, and not to say Paul's standard was too much, but it's a standard. I think we should try to copy, just the same thing as Paul was probably motivated to try to copy Jesus.
Yeah. And when you say Paul set the standard high, the first thing I think about is his argument with Barnabas over John Mark. Yeah. Paul didn't pull any punches.
Because John Mark, he abandoned him.
Yeah. And ultimately they reconciled, obviously. But this is it. And then I think we also need to take into consideration that this is Paul's last letter, last known writing, and all the indications seem to be Paul knows it. So there is a major difference from, like, if you read the book of Philippians to 2 Timothy. And the reason is Paul wrote Philippians in jail, but he had an expectation that he was going to get out. He says this over and over and over again, like, God's going to liberate me. It's a totally different tone in 2 Timothy. And we're going to see, I fought the good fight, and I finished the race, and all of these things. So this is a heavy, heavy tone. So it's really, really good stuff. Anything on this verse? This is it for our reading. Let's see. I'm just kind of scanning through my notes. We have the power, the love, and the sound mind. That sound mind is self-control, which is really, really good. I think it's something that we always need to remember. And no, I think that's about it. Here's the good thing, and here's the thing about, my biggest struggle, especially doing these podcasts, is I'll get done with the whole podcast, I'll just wrap it up, and then I'll still go back. Like, I'm not like, I'm done with this little section. I'll go back and I'll find it. I'll be like, man, I could have said this, I could have said that, but that's okay. So this is what we're doing. We're just here to talk. So for those of you at home, we want to say thank you so much for tuning in today. You can leave a comment on Spotify or wherever you're at. Let us know what you thought about Shiloh's tacos. And make sure you tune in tomorrow to hear Miguel's tacos. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for listening to Al Pastor with Brian Overturf. If you found value in this, please subscribe and get updates. Most places podcasts are available. We're right here on Anchor FM through Spotify, also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and iHeartRadio. I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Until then, we'll see you later.